Unix. Similar to that, we have a similar functionality in Windows by BitLocker, and this is something which comes natively with Windows. Now in Windows 11, the BitLocker has been updated to mandatory have a TPM module on the hardware for it to effectively manage the public and the private keys. But if you do not have a TPM chip, a limited functionality of BitLocker is still available, which we can use on our non-TPM based machines. Now, when we look at a BitLocker, or if you recollect Luke's encryption, we had a functionality of adding multiple passwords or the recovery keys to the encryption, and that was an advantage over a plain mode encryption. Similar to a Luke's mode, in BitLocker as well, we have that functionality or that enablement wherein we will be able to look at the encryption from a perspective of adding different keys or different passwords to the encryption method or the module. And what that allows is if I forgot one password or if I lost my key, I still have an ability to recover my data using the password or the alternate key, which I probably would have enabled or configured on my device. Now, quickly taking a look at it, we can manage the BitLocker, by the way, on a GUI as well and on a CLI as well. So to manage it on the CLI, we have to open it, the command prompt with an administrator rights. So if you see, I am an administrator kind of sudo that we ran. So now there is a command which is manage BDE, and this command allows me to manage the BitLocker encryption on my device. A simple one is to see the status. So it tells me what is the volume size, whether it is encrypted or decrypted, how much it is encrypted, what method is used, and all that stuff. So I can visually see the information here by the help of a manage BDE status command. Now, let me just see if I have another drive. No. Okay, let me try putting in a USB. Yeah. All right, so now I have a D drive as well. So it shows me the status of a D drive too. So what we'll try probably is to encrypt the D drive and see what happens. Now, status is just dumping the status of the overall encryption scheme on this device. Now, if I have to turn the encryption on, I have two options. Either I can encrypt the space that is already occupied on the device, which means that, for example, this is 14.91 GB as a total size. However, used is only 4.9 or 4 roughly. So I have an option where I can either encrypt the 4 GB of my disk space, which is a used disk space, or I can encrypt the complete USB or the complete disk. So I have that flexibility in BitLocker. Let's say I want to use the entire disk. So what I'll do, I'll just say on which drive I want to do it, on the D drive. Now, if I do it like this, entire D drive will be encrypted. If I say used space only, that will encrypt only the space which is used on the disk. So let's go with the full disk. Okay, I do not have a proper version, I believe. Let me try it on the another server. command is available. Status. So I have C and I have D. Let's try to do it here. On this provision storage, okay. Okay, so now it says use space only encryption is now in progress. Now, if I do the status again, it shows me the percentage completion as well, right? Which was not the case in the loops. So that's an added functionality you can say about Windows, that it shows the progress meter or the progress percentage as well. And now it is encrypted. Now, if you see, we have the encryption method as AES 128. But I don't want to use AES 128, but let's say want to use AES 256. So what I'll do, I'll first turn it off. I'll turn it off, and then while turning it on, I'll provide the encryption method that I want to use. So about to complete. Yep. So now it is fully decrypted, and percentage encrypted is 0. Encryption method is now. Now what I want to do is I want to turn it on. Use space only, but with the encryption method as AES 256. So that's something that I want to use.
Hello, sir. I mean, screen is not getting updated.
Yeah, I think
Is it
Yeah,
something
yes.
which everybody is facing, or
yes,
Yes,
Sir, not able. Yeah, I think now we are able to see.
there
now
is
you are able to see it?
there is a lag in fact.
90 seconds. Yep. To update.
Can you see it now?
Yes, sir, I'm able to see it.
Okay.
We can see, sir, but too much of lag.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to go slow. Now, if you see, if the screen is visible, now the encryption method is AES 256 with the 100% of the disk encrypted, which means that I was able to change my encryption method from AES 128 to AES 256. So that's something that we were able to achieve with the method encryption method parameter. Now, let's say I want to add a recovery password, which is right now, it is a pure system managed encryption, but I want to provide my password. So let's decrypt it again.
Is
While
it
it is happening.
case sensitive in a way to use that command used space only?
In Windows, it is case insensitive, so you can have it like capital, small, whatever.
Okay.
In Linux, it is case sensitive. All right, so it is decrypted now. So what I want to do now is to have a password, a recovery password that I can use. So same manage BDE command. I want to turn it on the D drive.
Sir,
At
it's
the same time, sorry.
still same problem, sir. I can only see manage BDE hyphen status.
Yeah, same here for me as well.
Okay, I'll take a pause then. Let me make an attempt of changing the network. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, Parsh, yeah.
Yes, sir. It's fine.
Okay, has the cursor moved?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So manage BDE on D drive, and this time I want to give a recovery password. Now I can either give it like a recovery password as a parameter, or in short, I can just say RP as well. That is also permissible. So the moment I do it, it shows that there is a numerical password which has been added, and this is a password that I need to note it down. Okay. There's a problem where I have not used the use space only. So if you see now, I have a password, which is this numerical password that I need to store, because if I lose this password, I'll not be able to recover my data, or I will not be able to decrypt my disk basically. Now, if I say manage BDE and then status again, it doesn't show me that what my passwords are, but it does indicate that I have two key protectors, and both are the numerical password that I have. Right now, let's say I want to basically look at what are those passwords, and what are those configured numerical passwords, so that I can take a backup of it, let's say. So I can add, delete, add the backup, all of that I can do it with the manage BDE command only. So what I'll do is I'll say manage BDE protectors, because that's a key protector. So I'm using the protectors as the command get on the D drive. So what I'll get to see is that I have two numerical passwords that I can take a screenshot, or I can copy and paste it, whatever I want to do, I can do it. Let's say I want to delete my numerical password first, and numerical password 2 I want to retain. So same command, manage BDE. Now protectors, because we are dealing with the security or the key, so protectors. Now this time I want to delete the protector, so I'll use the delete command, or the delete parameter. Delete from the D drive, and then I will have to give the ID of the protector, which is this. So I can copy it, paste it, and that's it. Now it's gives me a message that the key protector with ID was deleted. If I relook at it, I only have one protector on the D drive now. Earlier I had two, now I have only one. Similarly, if I have to add a protector, so rather than saying it as delete, I can just say add. So add a protector to a D drive. And when I say add a protector to a D drive, whether I want a recovery key or I want a recovery password. So both of them I can provide. Now, let's say I want to give it as a recovery password. So it automatically adds that as well. Now, if I want to give my own password, which is not the numeric password that BitLocker provides, but I want to give my password to protect the volume, I can give that as well. So so if you see here, it was a numerical password. Here it is a password. Now, if I dump the protectors on the D drive, I can see that I have a numerical password, which is a system generated password, and a password, which is a human entered password. So three methods I have now to recover my data from a D drive in any instance. If I lose the one of the encryption key, I can use the another one to recover my data. Similarly to a recovery password or the password, we can have a recovery key as well, which can be added to it. Now, when we have a recovery key, we have to provide the path where I want to save that recovery key to. So let's say I want to add a protector. Add a protector to D drive. And this time, rather than the recovery password, I want to add a recovery key. And recovery key, I want to save it to a C drive, let's say. Okay. Now, if you see, I have added another protector, which is an external key, and it is saved to a directory C drive. If I go into a C drive, uh, where is view options to see the hidden files? So this is the key that we have exported from a BitLocker 5E58314C. 5E58314C. So this is the key that we have exported. If you look at the content of a key, you will not be able to figure out what it is. But when you are recovering your system, you will be able to use this key to unlock your machine or unlock your device as well. So clear?
So now we have encrypted D drive, and how, other than command prompt, how I can ensure in GUI that D is encrypted or it's not accessible.
So in a GUI, it is very easy. So for example, you go here on a C drive. Let's say you want to encrypt this, turn on BitLocker. Similarly, you have here manage BitLocker. So back up your recovery key, change password, remove password, turn on auto unlock, turn off BitLocker. All of that you can do it here.
Okay.
With this BitLocker, can we detach the disk, like if BitLocker is enabled?
You can detach the disk, yes. I mean, if it is a USB or if it is a removable disk, but it is always advisable that you first, I mean, when you are detaching the disk, do it in a graceful fashion rather than the normal way of detaching it out like immediately. But when you, for example, if you have a USB drive that you are detaching it, so go here and then say detach it or unplug. That'll take care of the syncing of the data on the disk. If you just simply remove it, there you may corrupt your sectors onto it. That's the only thing. Otherwise, it's safe.
Okay.
So one more thing, do we have any advantage from CLI to GUI in
No, so only advantage of CLI versus a GUI is in CLI you can programmatically manage things. In GUI programmatically it is since it is a GUI element interaction, you need to have either a Visual Studio or some kind of a GUI programming to interact with those elements. On a CLI, it is you can execute the command and you can get the output of a command in a programmatic way. So that's the only benefit. Otherwise, it's the same thing.
Okay.
So just a couple of questions. So when you inserted the USB drive, right? So the total size of the disk was 16 GB.
Yes,
Okay,
14.9. Yeah,
14.9. Yeah. So the conversion status, it read as only it would encrypt the used space. So
correct.
if my used space is 10 GB, only that 10 GB would be encrypted.
Yes, 10 GB of the disk space would be encrypted.
Encrypted. Okay. Let's say after a few days, like a week or so, and then there is some amount of data that is again pushed into this USB drive,
Mhm.
and obviously the size would increase. Let's say it increases to 12 GB. So that
Correct.
difference would that also be increased or
Yes, so that is automatically managed by the operating system.
okay? So that would be taken care. And you recommend now that you mentioned that in case if this is a USB and it is BitLocker enabled, and I gracefully take out the or plug out the USB drive, and then I plug in to a different client machine. And at that point of time, when I open the or rather try to open the pen drive, will I be able to access the?
You will have to enter the recovery password.
I'll have to enter the recovery password. Only then I'll be allowed in.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what if the version of the OS is different from one system to other if we have to use that encrypted device in other machine?
OS version. So it's the, so for example, if you are using BitLocker and it is Windows to Windows, then BitLocker provides a backward compatibility. But if you want to mount a BitLocker drive on a Unix, you may not get that functionality.
Okay.
So will this support? So because right now, whatever encryption that you had done, that was done on a server,
Correct.
and this USB you
Windows to
can plug
Windows, it will support.
irrespective of whether it's a client machine or a server machine.
It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right, so we can have a use space only encryption. We can add a recovery password. We can have a recovery key and recovery password both put together. We can have a password with the specific encryption methods that we can choose from. We can have a startup key as well, which until or unless we insert into the system, it will not decrypt my machine. So I can have that startup key as an external drive. I can turn it off my encryption. I can unlock with my recovery key. So all of this is encryption and decryption related commands. Similarly, on the maintenance, you can get the protectors, you can add the protectors, you can have a recovery password and a recovery key, a password as well. You can delete a protector. You can also delete the startup key, add a backup. So all of that you can do it in the maintenance, and in a key management, you can change the key or change the password as well.
So a quick thing, how, can you explain the difference between the recovery key and the recovery password?
See, recovery key, recovery password is something you know. So you have it in your mind and you have to take up a backup of the recovery password. Recovery key is something you have stored on the disk. So let's say if you want to decrypt a drive, or if you want to recover a drive, then you have three options to choose. Either you enter a manual password that you something remember, provide a password which BitLocker has provided you and asked you to memorize or kind of note it down somewhere. Or the third option is you don't want to type in something, you have a recovery key with you, provide the location of that key. So it is just about how you provide a different mechanism, something you know or something you have.
Oh, got it. And is there any life cycle for this? Like, can we define a life cycle that you need to change the key or a password every
No,
3 months, or
no.
is it fixed?
So if you have to change it, you have to turn it off and then turn it on again.
Okay.
Or add a new password and delete the old password.
Mhm.
Sir, is there a centralized way to enable all systems, BitLocker for all systems within a domain through AD, or we have to do it individually? Like if a desktop support person has to enable it, has he have to do it manually on all the systems, or through Active Directory can he do it for all Windows systems at once?
So you can have a BitLocker managed through Active Directory as well. And what essentially that means is you can enable the computer or you can enable the policy to have a BitLocker enabled on the client system before the client system joins the domain. Okay, so that is one policy that you can do. The other is you can have all your BitLocker keys or the recovery passwords stored centrally in the Active Directory. So that is something that you can do. You can also enforce a BitLocker encryption through a Active Directory policy. So all of that you can manage.
Okay, so okay, sir. So in that scenario, all keys will be unique, no?
Yes, yes, yes. All keys are unique to the system.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Now, if this is clear, we'll come to the Active Directory and the group policies. Now, what happens is in Unix, for example, we have looked at pwquality.conf. All of that policies from a password configuration standpoint, we can manage in the Active Directory in a centralized place, or we can have it as a individual policy on the local system as well. The problem with the local system is specifically in any undomain joined network is that you have to manage those policy manually on each respective system or a computer. And that creates a problem when you have a large number of systems with you to manage those policies. And that is where Active Directory was identified as one of the advantageous environment or a package to be used within a networked environment, so that you have a centralized deployment and a consistent deployment of your security policies and the configuration as well. Now, in the Active Directory, essentially what it looks like is you have, so how it looks like is that you have a kind of a directory where, let's say this is a directory where you have certain components with you. So let's say you have computer accounts, you have all the users joined in, along with groups, computers, let's say, along with printers or other hardware, even the workstation or the wireless routers or the mobile. So mobile slash routers. So you can have this information. Now, what happened? When you have all these components, these are some of the components which are logical, and some of the components are physical in nature. All of these components you can have a centralized policy for configuration, and you can have centralized policy for security of these devices or these physical and physical and logical assets. Now, these assets or these computer, printers, routers, users, groups, all of these are referred to as objects. And what you can do is you can club these into a structured format to call it as a OU. So you can have an OU of these. So OU1, OU2, and OU3. So let's say this OU is sales department, and you have another OU which is engineering department. So you have two OUs now that you can club different hardware and the logical components to these respective OUs. And on all of these respective OUs, you can have a different policy for configuration depending upon the need. And on the engineering department, you can have a different policy depending upon the need. Plus, you can have a centralized or a global one as the policy as well, which you can apply, which means that this is, or the objects are the last component which receives the policy information, and OU are the logical units or the ways to manage these objects, and the centralized policies can be multiple. It can be OU based and it can be a global one. OU1, since it is relevant to the OU, takes a precedence. Since this is far from the OU, that's a secondary implementation, which means that the direction of flow of policy is this, from right to left. So, and this is kind of overrides the earlier component if it is not there. So for example, if I have a password policy here which says password should expire in 120 days, maximum password age is 120 days, And here the password configuration says a 30 days. So on this OU, a 30-day would get applicable. Why? Because this policy is near to the OU, so that takes a precedence. If my password policy is not configured in this OU policy, then a 120 day or 140 days policy, what is a global policy, will get applicable to this engineering department OU. Is this clear?
Yes.
Sir, I have a question here.
Yes.
So does it mean that all the policy processing happens on the server and the end host is not consuming any CPU cycles for, let us say, reminding about the password expiry or any of such activities?
So processing as in, so it's like you define the policy on the server, on the Active Directory server. The client, when the system boots up, it requests for the policy information from the domain server. It fetches all the policies that are available with the domain applicable to it. So it will fetch the global one, it will fetch the localized or the nearer one as well, or the OU based policy as well. And based on the priority, it will start to process those policy or enforce those controls accordingly. So let's say if you have changed the policy and you want to have that applicable immediately, you have to do a kind of a GP refresh or a group policy refresh on the client machine to download the new set of policy. So that you can do.
So from the server, can we also push commands instead of a client requesting for the configurations? Can we also push in commands to the clients?
You can have certain scripts created and put that into a sysvol folder on the Active Directory, which is a shared space. And through the Active Directory, you can ask the client to execute those scripts during the login time or the boot time as well.
Only once, is it? When the boot time happens, only then it will come in.
Only once, or you can have the scheduled tasks as well.
So there should be an agent running on the client as well for acknowledging all the Active Directory requests.
Correct. So once your system is Active Directory joined, then it continuously poll the server system to see what changes in the policy and then automatically downloads and use it.
Okay, thank you.
Clear?
Yes, sir.
Now, if we look at this, we have in Active Directory, we have a ntds.dit file, which stores everything of Active Directory into it. So when we do a forensics, let's say, this information is something which is of utmost importance to us because it'll have everything from a users to a policy. Every information that we have in Active Directory will be stored in this database in a structured way. So once we land ourselves into a forensics environment, then we definitely look for this ntds.dit file to be taken or to be imaged. Then in Active Directory, you also have a concept of multiple domain controllers, or let's say I'll come to this again. So what happened is, so let's say this is a forest. Under this, I can have multiple trees. And then I can have multiple domains as well under it. So I can have this kind of a structure where I have a forest, I have a tree, and I have a domain. What that means is, let's say I have a domain called race.com, and I have another domain which is race.in. So I have two domains, which is race.com and race.in. Both of them get into a common platform, which is, let's say, reva.edu.in. So both of them are like a sister concerns or kind of a subunits of reva.edu.in. Now tomorrow Reva gets into a partnership with iit.edu.in, and they want to launch something unique for the Indian education sector, and they launch something like ir.edu.in, which is iit and reva.edu.in. Now, if you look at ir.edu.in, that's like a forest where I have multiple tree-like structures with different domains under it. Okay. Now I can, within race.com as well, I can have multiple tree-like structures. So for example, I can have corp.race.com, I can have dev, I can have prod. So these are like subdomains which I have. So either I can call it as a subdomain, or if I want to call it as a domain, as a primary domain, we can kind of name it that way as well. But essentially in race.com, I have three subdomains. This is what my domain is, which goes under this tree structure, and this tree structure sits under this forest. All of these subdomains can have their own designated or dedicated Active Directory servers. So all of that, so I can have three ADs here, I can have an AD here, and I can have an AD here. Now, when we have three different domains, I can establish a trust relationship between them, which means that I want a user in prod.race.com to access resources in dev.race.com or corp.race.com as well. Now, since it is a different domain or a subdomain, I want to tell this dev.race.com to trust the authentication or the policies coming from prod.race.com. So I need to establish a trust relationship between these two. I have to establish a trust relationship between these two and this as well, so that my all the users in the business can authenticate or access printers, let's say, across different domains. So I need to build that trust relationship. If I do not want to have that trust relationship, let's say I want to keep dev.race.com as very confidential, and I don't want anybody to have access to its resources, I can avoid building a trust relationship between this and this. Same goes for prod. I don't want anybody from a dev to come to prod. I will not build a trust relationship between them. Yeah. So I can have or I can ignore the trust relationship between the different domains or the subdomains. Is it clear?
So basically, when we talk about trust relationship, how generally that get established, or how to establish trust relationship?
So we have to get into Windows Active Directory tools and just say, I want to build a trust relationship, give the target domain, give the credentials, and that's it.
Okay, if let's say from this example, if corp wants to establish trust relationship between dev as well as prod, ultimately all three has to be interconnected and have to have a trust relationship. If let's say corp is having trust relationship with dev and prod wants to have a trust relationship with dev again, so ultimately will prod have a trust relationship with corp?
No. So it has to be explicitly defined.
And how different
Can we
is
have
this?
Linux machines in this?
Sorry?
Yeah. Shreyas, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. No, it's just wondering, like, how different is this trust relationship different to the ADFS service?
So ADFS and trust relationship are two different things. So for example, can you access the services of, let's say I work with Microsoft, can I use the services of Google? The answer is no. Until or unless Google explicitly exposes something to us, we'll not be able to access it. But tomorrow, if Google and Microsoft gets into an amalgamation, then can I access some of the resources of Google based on trust relationship? Yes. So in Microsoft, I have my ADFS, wherein I have my services or the resources that I can use. In Google, they will have their own ADFS. They are using that service. But when it is two different domains that comes together, that's where you establish the trust relationship.
Okay.
Yeah. So does Linux machines play any role in this particular hierarchy, or can they take part in this kind of communication?
So you can have so you can have your Linux machine join the Active Directory as well now. So either through a Windows Active Directory, or you can also enable a LDAP services on the Unix, or the NIS or NIS Plus services on Linux or Unix, and you can have those systems work like Active Directory, but not really in Active Directory. But if you want a Linux server to be part of AD and receive the relevant policies from it, you can do that as well now.
Okay. And are these like any internet standards and RFCs for this, or is it Microsoft specific concept? AD?
The Active Directory.
Yes.
So when you say RFC, I mean you want to see the industry standard on which the Active Directory works.
Yes. Yeah. Like if there are multiple in a dynamical kind of trust relation, dynamically can be established in a trust relation instead of pre-configuring it,
No,
or is there
no,
any
it is
way
not
to?
dynamic. It is not dynamic.
Okay. And because the domains are going to be present part of the internet, so there should be some standards with, or some RFCs. That's what I am asking.
See, not necessarily you want to publish all this information over the internet. So you can have the trust relationship established on the VPN. You don't expose the Active Directory services on the internet. So even if I, for example, create an Active Directory, because this is a sensitive information, these are the sensitive configurations, and you don't want anybody externally trying or making an attempt to access or exploit these services. So as a best practice, Active Directory server is not put into a DMZ zone. It is largely used internally. And if you want Active Directory services to join or talk across the different networks or different domains, you do it over the VPN or a private network. You don't expose it over the internet.
Okay. So this is again the Microsoft specific concept.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, but it works on the LDAP protocol, which is open. LDAP protocol is just a backend of it, but there's a lot of customizations that has been done on it onto it. So, so yeah, that's where it differentiates.
Okay.
And so let's say if I have to set up a trust relationship between the corp and the prod environment, but within corp there are certain objects which I do not want to trust or other users access in the prod environment. So do we define that within the policies, or how would that be?
Yes. So trust relationship only allows a communication medium. That's it. It doesn't mean that everything in the core would be exposed to prod and vice versa. So if I want to access corp from a prod, I can establish my trust relationship to give that network path or to give that domain path to the users. Depending upon the uh, authorization of those users on those objects in core, they will be able to access those. If I don't have the authorizations in core on a specific resource, even if there is a trust relationship, I will not be able to access it.
Yeah, okay. Because sometimes I've come across scenarios wherein normally a domain joint mission, I mean, when we are logging in, it throws out an error like the trust relationship failed. So this could be due to the network, or there could be
Yes.
multiple factors. So
Yes.
okay.
So do we get to see that how we are going to define trust relationship in practical?
We can do that, but we need two different domains to do that.
Okay.
So is there any concept of virtual domain controllers?
Virtual domain controllers, nothing that I've heard, but we do have a cloud domain controllers now, where we have the Azure AD as a service where you don't have to put or configure your services onto the system. You can use the Azure Active Directory as the primary Active Directory for your organization, and it's basically a virtualized Active Directory for you.
And we can have multiple Active Directories on the same server itself, is it? The cloud server.
No, so you have only, so you can, so in cloud, you can have multiple domains in Azure Active Directory. But then if you are looking at a physical server or a virtual server on which you are installing an Active Directory services, you can host only one server per, one domain per server.
Oh, okay. So is it not required? That feature itself is not required, or
No, it is not required. It is not permissible and it is not required as well. Why? Because when you install an Active Directory on the server, then the DNS and the DHCP services also gets installed along with it. So on a single server, let's say you have a DNS server one running, which talks about corp.race.com, and on the same server you are hosting another which is prod.race.com. So that creates a conflict. Plus the directory services which are there, which is ntds.dit, it is stored on one location. So if you create another, it'll overwrite it.
okay.
Clear?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. So there are organizations that use a single domain controller, but when it comes to complex business requirement, branch office, redundancy, multiple domain controllers can be used or are required. So once you have multiple domain controllers in your organization, you can set up a replication between them as well, which means that a copy of your database would be available to the next domain controller and to the another domain controller in the same network or in the same trust. So if you have, let's say if your Active Directory is down, then the backup Active Directory or the secondary Active Directory server can replace in interim period your primary one and can act as a primary for authentication and authorization purposes, because the policies are replicated across. So that way you can have a primary DC or a PDC, and you can have a BDC or a backup DC or the SDC, which is a secondary domain controller. Then there is a concept of a RODC as well, wherein it's a read-only domain controller. You don't get to change anything on the RODC. It just simply receives a read-only copy of your Active Directory policies and keep it ready in case your primary DC fails. But you can't change anything on the RODC. On the secondary domain controller or a backup domain controller, you have an option to change the policy settings there, and then it will be replicated again across. So to avoid those changes or inadvertent changes, RODC concept was introduced so that even by mistake you don't change any policy on the RODC. Then there are two type of components which are available. One is a logical and the another one is a physical component. Both these components are essentially the last leg that you see. So these are the last leg that you see in the hierarchy, and they are sometimes called as a leaf objects as well. Okay. This is how the structure looks like from an Active Directory perspective, where you have users, groups, laptop, mobile, workstation, printers, and etc. So you have hardware and you have a logical users as well. You have a root, then you have an OU, then you have a sub OU. So you can have a OU kind of a structure in your Active Directory so that you can play with it. You can have different policies applicable on your different OUs. So all that you can do with the OUs. On different OUs, you can have different policies. So let's say on a root, you have a default policy. On the users, which is, let's say in sales, here it is 0, but let's say in the sales department you have a users, so on that you can have a sales user policy plus the default policy which is inherited. On the computers, you can have a sales computer policy rather than the user policy. So you can have a sales computer policy, and you can also disallow an inheritance of the default policy. So you can configure your OUs the way you want it to be. You can structure the OUs the way you want it to be, and the policies as well the way you want them to be applicable on those OUs and the underneath objects.
Sir, I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
This RODC, it is supposed to be like a backup in case if something happens to primary and secondary, right?
Yes. Yes.
So, so I would understand whatever standard policies which doesn't require frequent changes, all of them will be placed in RODC.
So all the policies will be stored in the RODC.
How frequently will these policies get upgraded? Usually, a typical practice.
See, usually it's a near real-time replication that happens between the Active Directory servers, but you can obviously configure the replication schedule and the time as well.
It's not clear, sir. See, if it is the period only, then how come where it is only one process is allowed to write into that, or how is it? Like, how is it read-only achieved there?
So let's say you have two servers. Both the servers are running a race.com domain. One is a primary and one is a secondary. So let's say you are a network administrator, you logged into a primary domain controller and you changed something. A replication happen and the change gets applicable or copied to the secondary domain controller as well. Now the another server admin logs into a secondary domain controller and changes something there, which gets replicated to your primary domain controller as well now. Which means that there can be a situation where there's a conflict of a policy between a primary and a secondary based on the changes that has been done. So to avoid that, a RODC was introduced, wherein as a system administrator, I will not be able to change anything on the RO Active Directory. Why? Because it is read only. So I can only receive a copy. I will not be able to send anything back, or I will not be able to change anything onto it.
Singleton kind of pattern.
Yes.
Oh. Okay, that was first question. Second question is, does the AD server maintain passwords, or is it only maintaining policies? Is it like a centralized passwords or only policies?
No, so policies are just the parameters like pwquality.conf. So it's like a policy. Similarly, in Active Directory, it's a policy. It doesn't store the password. But having said so, you have a centralized storage of the passwords on Windows as well. But that is up to you whether you want to save it with the reversible encryption or you want to save it with the irreversible encryption, which is the hashing. Similarly to what we have seen in Linux, where you have the hashes stored. Those are not the real passwords, but the hashes of those. Similarly, in Windows, you can have the passwords as a reversible encryption, or you can have a hashes with the irreversible encryption.
So it only has the policy, not the hash.
Both. So for the users that you create on the Active Directory, you will have policy plus you will have the, let's say, hashed password. So when I join a system, when I log into a domain from my laptop, my password, whatever I enter, goes to the server for authentication. Once it is authenticated from there, then I am able to log in. And during this time, I also cache my authentication token so that next time when I'm logged into my laptop, I don't have to go to Active Directory. I can use my cache to authenticate.
Okay, so this will also bring the concept of local users as well as the domain users,
Yes.
right?
Yes. But on the domain controller, you cannot have the local users. On the domain controller, which is a server.
Okay.
But on the
Alright, yeah.
machines, you can have both local as well as the remote users or the Active Directory users.
Yeah, got it, sir. Thank you.
All right. Now, you all have Windows servers with you.
Oh, no, sir.
Or none of you have the Windows, is it?
No.
Okay. Ruhul, can we have the Windows images or the server images made available to them?
Rajul, you're on mute.
I guess it's there on the desktop, on the Reva desktop, but
But you don't have the access to the Reva desktop, or how is it?
Yeah.
I think we have to set up a VPN in our system to access remote machine.
So that'll take time. Anyways, so we can have that fixed, but whosoever have access to the the Windows servers, I can just show you how to do it. Okay, so see, we are in a Windows environment. Most of the things that we'll do is GUI. Okay. So I have this server which is already having a Active Directory installed. Okay, so that's where you see ADDS, DNS services pre-installed onto it. But let's say you want to do it. Let me show you on the another server. So you go to this server manager and you say add roles and features. Then role based, yes, select your server. Okay. Now in the server role, these are the different roles which are available for you to select. So here you will have to select the Windows or the Active Directory domain services. Click next. You don't have to choose anything here. Next. And then on this side, you will again have to say, let's say yes. Now you have the ADDS tools confirmation that this is something that will be installed. Once you have installed it, you will on this flag you will see a configure remote or the configure domain controller option. So you go there and you give the domain name. So right now the domain that I have here, not here. The domain that I have here is a race.com domain. So if you see, it is online, and this is what my IP looks like, and this is what my server name is. Now I can go to my Active Directory domains and trusts. This is where I can set up my trust, and this is where I can see my race.com domain as well. If you see right now, my functional level is a backward compatible, which means I have enabled it to work with Windows Server 2012 domains or the forest as well. But at the same time, I can elevate it to say minimum 2016 server is required for a trust relationship to be established. So I can have those rules or I can have those restrictions configured in this. Similarly, you can change the Active Directory domain controller. If you have multiple domain controllers, you can choose which is your primary domain controller or which is the one who is the master domain controller in this particular domain, which is a race.com. Okay. Similarly, you can change the forest. So right now, since it is a single domain, the forest is root.com. If you want to change it, you can change it from here. You can raise the forest functional level, which is the same. And in the manage domains, basically you get to open the Active Directory users and computers. You can directly open it from here as well. You can directly open it from here, or you can manage the domain directly and open the snap in here. In this snap-in, what you see is a domain name. You see different containers that are available. You can have your own OU created here. So this is batch 08. So you can have OU created here. In this OU, you can have another OU created here. This is like OS security. So you can have another OU. In this OU, you can have another OU, which is, let's say, users. So likewise, you can create a tree structure for your OUs as well. These are predefined users which are there in your Active Directory. You can add users here. So user login name. This is how it look like for a pre Windows 2000, but in the newer generation, we use u1@raise.com. Next, give the password. Then you have an option, user must change password at next logon, yes or no. User cannot change the password, password never expire, or account is disabled. So all that an option you can choose. Okay. Okay, so I have this U1 user created. If I look into a properties of U1, and if I go to an account, I can see those policies or the checkboxes here, which I have seen it while creating the user, plus some additional properties. So for example, I can say the user must change password at next logon. So I can enable or disable it. User cannot change password, password never expire, account is disabled. I can use that. I can also provide an account expiration, which we were able to provide in the Unix as well using the passwd command. Similarly, logon hours is something that I can specify that during this to this time on these days, my users will be allowed access. Otherwise, they will be denied access from an authentication standpoint. Okay, so if my, let's say in a manufacturing unit, I don't expect anybody to work beyond 7 o'clock in the evening. So I can deactivate or I can disallow those login or a working hours for the user from this screen itself. So I will just say, for example, this is 12/6. So on Sunday, I don't expect anybody to log in. On Saturday, I don't expect anybody to log in. After 7, I don't expect anybody to log in. And before 8, I don't expect anybody to log in as well. So which means this is what my working hours are. And only the users between Monday to Friday during these hours would be allowed to log in or use, which is Monday from 5 to 6. Or rather this. So 8 to 6 is what I think is a permissible time. And I'll click OK. So my login hours are saved for this U1. If I make an attempt to use any other time, I will not be able to do so. Okay. Similarly, I can have a domain membership or a group membership for this user. So I can come here and I can add a user to different groups which are available to me in order to give extra permissions, let's say, or in order to give a precise permission to this user. So I can have those groups added here. By default, the user is part of a domain users from a usage of the user ID perspective. Clear?
Sir, is it mandatory for the domain controller to be in the same time zone as the rest of devices or physical resources?
See, Active Directory usually, or the server, is the one which is used as a NTP or a network time source server as well. And what happen if, let's say, you have an Active Directory server which is hosted in US and you are operating from India and you don't have an Active Directory server in India? The problem is not the time, because that will automatically be converted by your machine in the appropriate time zone. But the problem is on the latency of the authentication request. Because of the number of hops that you would take to reach US server and get the response back, that hops count would be higher as compared to if you have a localized server in India, let's say. So the number of hops to reach the India directory server would be lesser than the US directory server, and hence it is preferred to have a local directory server. It can be RODC as well, but a copy of your policy should be available locally.
Okay. Yeah, clear, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. So I have a users here. I have a user rather here. Similarly, I can have a computer, contact, group, all of this I can create along with a shared folder as well, which means that my shared folder would be available across the domain to be used. So I just have to give raise.com or this particular IP of the domain controller and then the shared folder, and the server or the folder would be available to me. So that also I can provide if I want to make it as a centralized server storage or a storage server. I can do that as well. Okay. Now, if I go to the properties, nothing specific here other than you can provide the person who owns this OU from a contact standpoint. You can provide that information. So in case you need to change anything or you want an update in this at an enterprise level, you know who to contact for making an update or a change into this particular OU. Then you have a administration center or a administrative center as well, and you have sites and services. So the concept of a site is how many sites you have in India. For example, you have one in Bangalore, one in Chennai, one in Hyderabad. So you can define those subnets, you can have those sites created, and you can allocate the Active Directory servers to those sites to serve the purpose of those local sites only. So that's the purpose of the sites and services. Similarly, you have the users and computers, which is this particular snap-in that we have seen. Domain and trust we have seen. What is this? PowerShell, and this is administrative center. Now, if you look at this administrative center, here you will be able to do a lot of things which are more of an operational in nature. For example, changing a username and a password, you can do it. You can search a global Active Directory here. You can manage, because it's local, you can manage your OUs from this. You can new, delete, move, all of that you can do. So rather than opening the different snap-ins, you can manage everything on this particular interface. Similarly, from an authentication standpoint, you can have authentication policies here, which you can define. So if you say new policy, you will be able to provide a new authentication policy for your users, wherein you will be able to create the silos or a single sign-on or a service sign-on. You will be able to create that. You can do all of this using different snap-ins. It's just another layer of a UI that you have. Rather than opening the MMCs or the Microsoft Management Console, you manage those policies from there. Now you can also manage the control, and you can provide a delegation of the control to different users as well. By default, enterprise admins and the domain admins, member of those groups, would be able to manage your Active Directory. But in case you want to give ownership or an accountability or a responsibility rather of managing these domains to another user, you can have those users added here. So I want to give or delegate the control of managing this race.com to U1. I can select different tasks that I want to provide, or I can have a custom task to delegate. So let's say I want to give a create, delete, and manage user accounts. So my U1 would be an administrator or a help desk person to whom the tickets would be routed for the user creation, deletion, or changing of a password. So those activities will be done by the U1, and that's it. Now, if I go to delegate control again, I don't have any other user, but I can have another user as U2 and give another control to those users as well. Now let's look at the profile of a U1. He's still a part of domain users. So he's not a part of enterprise admin or the domain admin, yet he will be able to manage the delegation that we have provided to this individual. So likewise, we can have multiple delegations managed or created in the Active Directory for the users, so that we can have more span of control and more configurable controls over the objects. Now, so should we take a 15 minutes break? I'll also get a coffee for me.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sure, sir.
Okay.
Sure, sir. Sure.
And Rujul, by that time, can we have a Windows servers images kind of made available to them?
Yes, sir. I'll
Sure.
talk to the IT service.
Sure. So are we back?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Ruju. And did we provision the Windows servers to the team?
Yes, sir. They can remotely access the desktops in the lab, and they have the Windows server.
Okay, perfect. Perfect.
Yes.
All right. So let me share my screen once again. You can see my screen.
Yes, sir.
All right. So now we have group policy management as well, wherein if you see, we have a domain, we have a default domain policy as well. The OU that we created of batch 08, then the OS security, and then the users. So we have those OUs available here. We have domain controllers as the OU, which means that we can define specific policy for the domain controllers. And that policy would take precedence because that is near to the OU. Similarly, on different group policy OUs, we can have those different policy. We have two objects here from a policy. One is a default domain policy, and the other one is a default domain policy. So these two policies are my group policy objects, which I can see it here. So I can see those policies here. Similarly, I can define my own policies as well. So for example, I want a different policy on batch 08. I want a different policy on OS security and a different policy on user. I can do that. Okay. So let's say I want to create a new GPO or a group policy object in this domain and link it here. Or I can define a policy here, and then later on I can link that policy by linking existing GPO here. Okay, I can block the inheritance of the above policies to this OU by clicking here, or I can do the GPO update. I can do a group policy update here. So let's say I want to create a new policy and I want to name it as a batch 08 OS security users policy. So this is my name of a policy, and then okay, this policy gets created. I can edit this policy. Now when I am into a policy editor, there are two things that I notice. One is a user preference and the second one is a computer preference. Now so from a computer and a user preference perspective, I can have different policies and different configuration. So for example, how my network can behave, so I can define different policies here. How my control panel or what kind of a control panel snap-ins availability I need to provide, I can define it here. Similarly, software restrictions I can provide or installation. Similarly, on a Windows settings, I can provide a security settings. On the registry, on the account policies, all of that I can define. So for example, if I go to an account policy, I can see a password policy, and this password policy has certain components. By default, it is not configured or not defined. I can define these parameters here. If I say store password with reversible encryption means encrypted password. If I tell it to no, then it is a hashed password. So I can set different parameters here. So my minimum password length is, let's say, 8 characters. My maximum password age, let's say, is 90 days. So minimum password age automatically set to 30 days. Password history, I want to define it as 3. So 30 into 3 is 90. So that's where my maximum password age would go. Minimum password length. And must meet complexity requirements. Yes. So that's what my password policy looks like. Similarly, I can have my account lockout policy in terms of what is the lockout duration threshold and reset the lockout, when to reset the lockout as well. So I can have these configured as well. Similarly, if I look at advanced audit policy here, I can define it at a granular level as well in terms of what kind of auditing do I need to log. For example, a credential validation, authentication, other account logon events, account management, then directory service access, log on, log off, object access for a file level or a file share access, I can define. So all of these auditing related policies is what I can define. In total, the audit policies are 58 in number that we can define. And I mean 10 at a category level and 58 in total at a granular level is what we can define. And from a basic auditing perspective, we can have up to 9 auditing tasks. So all of these policies is something that we can configure. Similarly to this, we can have a control over registry. We can have, so basic auditing, for example, I can go to local policies and I can set a audit policy here. So these policies is something that I can define. Similarly, I can define a security options in terms of who can log in, who cannot log in, whether the interactive logon is enabled for the users or not. So I can define that as well. All that policy I can manage it here. So this policy, once you granularly review and control this policy, you can simply close it because it is auto saved. So you have this policy enabled. You can delegate or provide the delegation of the policy here. You can also block the inheritance of the policy. So if you look at a precedence 2, a precedence 1, so you can change the precedence level, or you can simply go to this default domain policy. You can see what kind of policy configuration is there, and delta you can control, or delta you can create in the batch 08 policy, so that you know exactly what kind of parameters you are overriding or what kind of parameters you need to configure. So you need to compare these two policy and then create your own security policy. You can have a different policy here by creating a GPO, give that name, and again configure that policy. And you can have a different policy at here. So that's how you create a different policies within the domain. And if you look at, this is a forest, and these are the domains which are under this forest. Now, two set of policies which are available, basic auditing policy and advanced auditing policy. Role delegation we have already looked at earlier. But yeah, these are something that you can configure. Then from a policy conflict standpoint, where you have a policy 1, policy 2, and a policy 3, what you can do is just remember the LSDOU kind of a model. Now, this LSDOU is a rule which provides you which policy essentially would win, right? So if you look at, it's a local site domain OU. So that's the policy preference that will that will win, and it will move from left to right, which means that depending upon whatever is nearer to the object, that policy would essentially win the competition of the inheritance. And that way you will be able to create more policies for your OU, and you would know that these are the policy which will win my battle. So when we do a audit of any system, we normally run a RSOP. So for example, here I will just write rsop.msc, and that gives me a resultant set of policy with my existing name, what policy is effective on my machine. So I will be able to get that clarity on the policy. So for example, Windows security account password. So if you look at, this is the policy, which is 24 passwords, and what is the policy reference from where I'm getting it. It is 24 passwords remembered, 42 days, 1 day as a password age, 7 characters as the length. Now, if I look at this policy, what is my domain policy says. So if I look into this password policy, 24 passwords, 42 days. So 24 passwords, 42 days, 1 day, 7 characters. This is enabled and this is disabled. So, and this is coming from a default domain policy as well. So which means that on my machine, this policy is winning the race or winning the applicability or enforcement. So when we run RSOP, we can look at policy is getting implemented and how I am getting the resultant set of policy. Now I have another server. Let's try U1 as well onto it. First, let me just do an GP update. So my group policy is updated here. Let me log in with the new user. How would I change?
Changing the time on the system can allow.
No. Okay. Okay, I'll figure it out. Ideally, this should do the trick. Interesting. Okay, I'll check this. But essentially, once you log into this U1 and you run the RSOP, you will get to see the different policy name here. Right now, it is coming at default domain policy, but when you log in with U1, you will get to see the batch 08 OS security users policy. Okay. And if you have got access to your domain controllers, try installing the AD services onto your system as well, and just follow the steps as we move ahead. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
One quick question. So always the local group policy would take precedence over the Active Directory policy that we apply, is it?
Yes.
Okay. And if it's a policy that is applied through the Active Directory, the policy that is, I mean, if the policy that is applied at the OU level would take precedence over the global policy.
Yes.
Okay.
Sir, I have two questions.
Yeah.
What kind of configuration should we do on the host machine so that it picks up or it contacts the server when it boots up? That's
Sorry,
first.
just
Uh,
please come that again.
yeah. So on the host machine, that
Mhm.
is the Windows machine, local host machine. What kind of where should we do what kind of configuration so that it will contact AD server upon boot up?
That I'll tell you. So you have to get your system joined to a domain to receive the group policy.
Okay.
So let me just try once again. So if you have to get your system added to a domain, go to the PC and go to the properties. Click on change settings. Click on change settings. Right now it is already added, but you click on change, by default it is work group. So you do a domain and add the domain that you have configured and click OK. It will ask you for the username and the password of the enterprise admin. Provide that username and password and you are done.
Okay. And like var run messages, right? Do we have equivalent in Windows?
Yes, you have event viewer where you can look at the messages or the logs.
Yeah,
Can
but
we remotely view this?
Sorry.
Sorry. Can we remotely view the event viewer from the AD server?
By default, no, but you have different components that you can install. For example, syslog ng is a package, third-party package that you can install, and with that you can send the remote logs. Also, if you don't want to go that route, you can within the Active Directory environment you can create subscriptions, and with those subscriptions you will be able to send the logs remotely to a central server.
So in a typical corporate network, is it a general practice to send across syslogs continuously, or is it
Yes.
one
Yes.
shot, something like that?
No. It is preferred to send continuously because when the attack happen, you don't know. So if you have an agent, like for example, OSSec is one utility that I have seen being used for both Windows and Linux, and it continuously sends the log. And you can obviously schedule it to send at a particular time or a schedule. You can do that as well, but it is preferred to send the logs continuously. Selective logs, not all the logs, but selective logs.
So what are the what are the high priority logs which I have to look out, like some kind of heads up kind of logs?
Essentially, the log on and log off are the high priority logs that you send because that allows you to validate if somebody has attempted a failed login or a successful login. So that's one of the log. The least preferred are the disk activity log, because there's so much of activity that can happen. So that's the least preferred logs, the disk activity.
So anytime any application crashes or any application gives some fails to launch, can I go to the event viewer and check for the details, or is there any other for applications?
Yes. So for example, I can go to the event viewer. I have Windows logs, so application security, setup, system, forwarded events, all of that. So application, I will get to see the services. Like if I'm running a specific application, I would be able to filter it out and look what kind of errors I'm getting there. This is more from a success, failure, login, authorized access, all of that. I will be able to see that. This is more like a setup or an installation that we do, so we get to see that information. And these are the system logs, which is if my service is getting stopped, so I would be able to look at those services.
Okay, sir. Clear. Thank you.
And so, what are the ways where the Active Directory or the server gets compromised?
What are the different ways?
Yeah.
Multiple ways. I mean, from a directory services perspective, one thing you don't need obviously is that the directory services are exposed over the internet. Why? Because they can be brute forced as well. And if they are kind of attacked, then you are exposing the entire enterprise information over to the attacker. So from a Active Directory hacking or a compromise perspective, there is a tool which is called as Bloodhound. What it creates is it makes an attempt of a null session to validate whether the or what kind of information is available in the Active Directory, and it tries to create the passage for the different leaves or the last objects that you have. Then you also, so once you have the information about an Active Directory structure, you would be able to target it much more better. The second is a local privilege escalation. So if your operating system is not running up to the mark and if your accounts are compromised, a local privilege escalation can happen on your Active Directory. Then a lateral movement can also be there. Domain privilege escalation can happen with the Kerberos as one of the techniques. Then spray or the password spray attacks can happen, which has an ability to gauge or check the different passwords at the same time. So that's like a spray attack that you can do. Then abusing the ACLs is what you can do, which is an access control list that you can perform. uh, Printers exploitation you can do. Golden ticket attack that you can do. You can make an attempt to copy or dump your DNS information to another DNS server so that you get exposed to the entire corporate network. You can make an attempt to create a trust tickets. So all these attacks you can try with the Active Directory, and hence you don't prefer to put it into a public domain.
So for yeah, please go ahead, Shiv.
So when we say that local privilege escalation, it could be the local user account is compromised and then the attacker can take control of
Yes.
the machine.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So every corporate must be using this AD server because all of them usually have Windows machines. Is this assumption
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay. So if we listen at a switch in the promiscuous mode,
If we listen at a switch, okay.
In the promiscuous mode, or yeah, maybe some router if we are able to get a hang of it, then can we? How will there be continuously running AD traffic, or only when the boots up? That's it. Usually, there won't be much of AD traffic. Is that how it is?
No, so there would be a AD traffic. Why? Because of the policy sync, because of the DNS request, because of the DHCP request, because of the NTP time information request, authentication request. And if you have configured shares onto the Active Directory, you will have that traffic as well. So Active Directory is not only for a user authentication, but can be used for the printers, let's say, as well. So if you're printing something, it'll go via Active Directory to the printer. So that way you will have a lot of traffic. And in the enterprise, we don't have 10 or 20 users. We have hundreds and thousands of users there. So there would definitely be activity on the switch if it is a core switch.
Okay. So by this, right, is this encrypted traffic? All the traffic
Yes,
which run?
encrypted. With the Kerberos encryption, the traffic would be encrypted.
And it's a asymmetric encryption or
The Kerberos?
yeah.
Yes. So it's basically based on the ticketing method, the way Kerberos works, and it assigns a ticket, basically a key, to a particular system, and then the system uses that key to generate the traffic. And it's a dynamic ticket. It's not a fixed ticket that each system gets.
So does it go through all the standard phases of VPN phase 1, phase 2, kind of like asymmetric key establishment?
Yes.
And so it will be referring to a local certificate authority. Is it how it works?
And also it has a Kerberos store, which so basically what happens when your system joins a domain and when your system boots up, it gets a Kerberos ticket or a ticket to sign the messages and stuff. So once it is up and running, then you use that Kerberos ticket to encrypt your traffic and send it to the domain controller, and that ticket gets updated time to time. And once your system restarts, you get a fresh ticket again. So it's like you do not have that ticket fixed for any moment of time. So you have used that ticket, you will get a fresh ticket. You have used that ticket, you will get the new ticket. So that's how it will function. So that way you don't have uh, a certificate server, so as to say, but you do have a Kerberos store which manage internally all the tickets for Active Directory.
Oh, in that case, anybody can pose as an AD server and respond back to a request.
Until or unless you have a domain joined machine. So if I'm not part of the AD, um, I will not be able to get the Kerberos ticket. So I have to be part of the domain to get that Kerberos ticket.
Can't a man in the middle simulate that?
You see, man in the middle can happen, and that is where you have this golden ticket attack and the silver ticket attack. You have those attack vectors, but it is not easy to compromise or launch those attacks because you need the authentication of the domain as well to basically manage your system.
Okay.
But yes, you do can have ticket attacks in the AD environment.
But this should be a symmetric encryption, right? Because already we would have configured what should be the domain username and password on this.
No, it is not on the domain users and passwords. So it is a refresh of a ticket that happened. So for example, I am a system, you are Active Directory. So if I boots up, I'll ask you for a ticket. You give me a ticket. I'll use that ticket, then you will give me another ticket. I'll use that and then you will give me another ticket, which is not asymmetric in a sense, it is not fixed. It is not asymmetric in a sense, it is not based on private and a public key.
Okay, but for the first time when you are requesting, you should have joined the domain for
I
which you
should
should
have
have
joined the
known the
domain.
username
Yes.
and password.
No, I should have joined the domain. That's it. Because when my system boots up, the domain comes first and then the user. User is only to log into the server or the system or the laptop, let's say. So it can be you, it can be me, it can be somebody else. But when my login screen comes, at that time, my system is already part of the domain. So the keys or the Kerberos ticket has already been negotiated.
So the act of joining a domain is as good as getting registered at the AD server.
Yes. So it's like you are part of now a trusted network or a closed group network where a third party, if they need to join in or view the traffic, they need to be part of the domain, and then they can do some malicious attempts.
So any system which is placed in the network, which is configured with the same domain details, it should be able to join the AD network, right? The domain.
Means?
Like let us say I bring my laptop, and if I configure it into the same domain, and if I plug it in the, let us say, one working port, it should be able to contact if I provide the AD server details.
Yeah.
To contact, right? So
Yes.
there is no authentication done by the AD server to whether accept this particular laptop or. Oh, it happens in the physical resources.
It happens before the user, correct?
Okay.
That is where, when you do this change setting, this domain, which is winpen01.race.com, this hostname is set first before the user screen appears. Right? And for this to happen, race.com, you have to join the domain.
Okay.
And also, in order to join the domain, we should have the DNS pointing to that AD server. Correct?
Yes. Okay. Now let me just make a last attempt. So now let me write okay. Clear?
think we have to work on this lab. We have this system set up now. I was saying we have to just practice on this part which you have explained for a while now.
So we'll take a lunch break. I think in India it'll be 1. So we'll take a lunch break now and we'll be back by 2 o'clock India time. That should be okay.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yeah, sure.
So at 2:10 we will be back, no? Okay.
What's
Yes,
the time
yes.
there? It is 1 or 1:10?
It's
It's
1-7,
around
sir.
1:07. Okay. Sure. So we'll be back by 2:10 then.